Dr. Christel Temple from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Temple.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asante, for that humbling introduction. I'm just happy to be here. I'm just happy to have gone to Temple. I'm happy to be among elders and friends and those who would be out on Valentine's Day, Black Love Day at 4 o'clock. And just thank you so much for coming to hear my talk. So yes, the anthem volume of Muhammad Ali and Africana Cultural Memory is going to be on time. I can start working on that Friday night after I do my next major Black History talk. And so we were just about finished. It's just cleaning and polishing and going to copy editing. Okay, so two things happened in the past couple of years. One recently, once in a couple of years. So I was department chair at University of Pittsburgh, and a non-African, is this being recorded? Yes, I don't know. Okay, it doesn't matter. A non-African American young lady called me on the phone, and she was in our English department. She just arrived at my university, and I was department chair, and she called me and schooled me and told me that she and the English department chair were scheduled for a meeting with one of our deans of undergraduate studies, and that they were going to get a minor in the English department in Black studies. I can't even say that with a straight face. And as a courtesy, you know, she thought she would call me. She did film media with a PhD in gender and women's studies, and she was new, just got there. And she, as a courtesy, she called the chair of Africana and said, you know, we want you to be on board. We just want to let you know so we don't kind of just run roughshod over your department. And we'd like for you to be on board so, you know, it won't look like we're just taking your stuff. And I'm paraphrasing. So English, getting a minor in Black studies at a university that has an independent, autonomous department of Africana studies. So just let that sit with you for a minute. The other part is recently I read somewhere where someone accused me of African-American exceptionalism. And I said, and for the source, I just had to chuckle. And so those are the two things in my mind as I bring this to you today. So I have a quick written lecture, then I have a PowerPoint. So Dr. Asante, will I be able to shift over and share my screen? You might have to make me co-host in a moment when I get to the PowerPoint, okay? Okay, so I'm going to start. So it's okay to be political, to be concise this afternoon, in observing that English departments and degrees that now identify themselves as having academic tracks in African American literature and culture are often pretending to be Africology departments, pretending to give an Africana Studies credential without actually pursuing the type of methodological training and grounding that prepares scholars to be the type of stewards needed to maintain the legacy of contemporary Africana Studies departments. We can admit that there is a watering down, but that charged terrain does not interrupt our cultural authority to do work to stabilize the discipline. What we do in Africana literature is a reflection of our priorities, our assumptions, and our unique epistemologies. This is exceptional, unique, innovative, rare, intellectually vibrant in terms of breaking new ground. As a definition, exceptional does not mean that we make claims against anyone else or claims of superiority. It means that we acknowledge the condition of being unique, of being specialized. In our approach, there are theories that order what we do, theories that make sure that we do not conform to the norms or to what is mainstream, and that we do not conform or just join in with a format of culturally limiting the exceptional to only references to white, Western, or mainstream disciplinary approaches. Exceptional means that we are unusual, we are extraordinary, we are rare, we are unusually excellent in what we do, we are intellectually gifted, again, in our Africological lane. So in my 2007 literary anthology, Introduction to, I'm going to share my screen now because this is when, there we go. I don't have any video clips. Okay, from beginning. From beginning, there we go. Okay, so in my In my 2007 literary anthology, Introduction to, can you see my Zoom box covering the book?
No, we can see it.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. In my 2007 literary anthology, Literary Spaces, Introduction to Comparative Literature, I gathered texts and excerpts from 23 countries, islands, territories, and/or regions of the African world to demonstrate the vitality of the full Afrikaner literary world. This is exceptionalism too, as in, not my work, but as in taking the field of comparative literature at its own negative critique, where they said, yes, we failed. Yes, we told you that CompLit was the site where you could do immersion literary studies for any region in the world, but yet in our curriculum, we forced you to take an 80 or 90% European, American, or Western core before we even allowed you to be immersed in the African or the Asian or the Polynesian or the Latino or the gendered literature of your choice. So it is exceptional. It is rare that in Africana studies, we take immersion seriously to transmit Africana content, ideas, epistemologies, priorities, and assumptions, traditions, intellectual traditions, and genealogies. When we do this, we give students and the community and the world something truly unique from what you get in traditional or mainstream academic sites. And they are unique too in their own lane. So recently I read where another scholar accused me of exceptionalism for my approach to my first book, Literary Pan-Africanism, History, Context, and Criticism. This work was an example of Africological idea formation related to literature in terms of what do we do after we read. Let me repeat that. What do we do? Behavior, pursuits, alignment. What do we do after we read? And so what happened was I read a Ghanaian play. The play was called Dilemma of a Ghost, and it was written by Ama Ata Adu. As an Africological thinker, I honed in on the fact that a Ghanaian writer created an African-American character in her play. As an Africological thinker, I immediately paired, listen to that word, paired, I immediately paired this literary phenomenon with number one, with the history of information exchange about the enslavement experience between Africans who remained at home and Africans who were sold across the Middle Passage. The research question was, how did Ama Ata Adu know about African Americans enough to write a play with the dominant character? The second phenomenon was related to Pan-Africanism with the research question of, wow, since this play takes as its theme the intricate aspects of regenerating relationships between African and African Americans, how does it fit in contemporary Pan-Africanist discourses? And so these are the sustained inquiries that will not happen in an English classroom. And it's okay. Africana Studies is the site where we do what we do, or like Ray Charles said, I'm gonna make it do what it do, right? And so finally, I researched the phenomenon to learn if other African writers were doing the same thing, enough that I could identify a trend or an intellectual tradition of such literary Pan-Africanism that I could document it and then structure a model of literary criticism. And this would be a methodology for precisely what angle we should consider when we encounter literature or storylines related to such Pan-African idea formation and reconciliation. So in comparison, the English scholars who published about the play were concerned with, quote, the dilemma structure of how a writer uses a literary work to solve a problem. And so if you go to the Penguin Handbook on literary studies, there's something called the dilemma, and it's kind of like a riddle in literature. And so his discussion remained in the realm of the story, not beyond it. And it didn't go to his discussion didn't go to African global history from the 16th to the 20th centuries. It didn't go to a content analysis of the African World Journal, Black Orpheus. It did not go to identifying the resolutions of the 7th Pan-African Congress held in Kampala, Uganda in April of 1994, which was the most recent Congress that articulated a coherent objective of Pan-Africanism at the time I wrote my book. Another white literary critic used the play from English to wonder about how much the issue of romantic love actually appears in African literature. So in my approach to reading this play, I followed the cues of African writers who wrote about African Americans. They didn't write about Cubans, they didn't write about Jamaicans, they didn't write about Afro-Europeans, they wrote about African Americans. And so when this scholar got snarky because my book didn't address other regions of Africa in the diaspora, I was like, okay, you know, the work stands for itself. But in fact, I explicitly stated in my work, my Afrocentric study, that this is a limited domain. my page count of 200 pages is following what these particular African writers did. So finally, by writing a book on the phenomenon that links West African literature, enslavement history, traditional and contemporary Pan-Africanism, the history of an African world literature, in Culture Journal and literary criticism, I produced enough content in a book to contribute and sustain curricular innovation in Africana studies. That means the creation of a new course. And I have that course, I'm working on it, and I have to submit the paperwork for it at Pitt. And so I even teach the course as a subsidiary of Africana literature or Africana world literature. So linking the ideas found in a literary text to a real life subject area of Africana studies is called pairing. That's the second time I'm introducing that word. Plus I relied on Africological literary tools of disciplinary competency, dutiful survey, and something I call the bibliographic shift. And I'll have a slide that introduces those in just a minute. And so the reliance on an Afrocentric and African-centered corpus of scholarship meant that in my book, I was not required to prioritize post-colonial studies and on studies beyond my relevant school of thought. In my book, in the Afrocentric school of thought, there was sufficient sources available in terms of where the research mapped itself. I didn't have to map it. I had to follow the traditions to see where it went. There was no Foucault, there was no Derrida, there was no Stuart Hall, there was no Gayatri Spivak, there was no Paul Gilroy, no post-colonial studies, no Edward Said. But in the mapping the topic, I was taken to scholars such as Molefi Ketiasante, Kariyamu Welsh, Harold Cruz, St. Clair Drake, Joseph Harris, Amilcar Cabral, Maya Angelou, Alexander Crummell, W.E.B. Du Bois, Linda James Myers, Nathan Huggins, C.T. Cato, Ezekiel Impahele, Renuka Rashida, Walter Rodney, and more. And so the research questions and the thinkers whose ideas enable an intellectual discourse exceptionally in Africology represent a school of thought and ground us in disciplinary competency. This is exceptionalism. This is a good thing. This reminds us that there is something ordered, logical, and structurally unique in how we do scholarship in the discipline of Africana studies. People can't knock it. They have no right to disallow it, to disallow our school of thought, and I do not stand for it. We have choices. We're not intellectual prisoners. We're not enslaved to the Academy's epistemic bullying, and we will not be punked. And so our assessments of Du Bois, of Maria Stewart, of Shirley Chisholm, Paul Robeson, Muhammad Ali, and even Beyonce are going to be different because we use a different and a unique set of tools that represent Africana studies. And so I'm shifting to, in my more recent book, Transcendence and the Africana Literary Enterprise, I was able to offer a set of more focused objectives and tools that describe our work and our enterprise. And so don't get me wrong, I don't even know if we have enough literary scholars in Africana studies to have one in each department to sustain what I offer here. But the point is, there is a learning curve. You can come to our departments with the willingness to know and to learn and to respect the traditions and the grounding of Africana studies and learn some of this rather than trying to have a toe in Africana and a toe somewhere else. Even at my own institution, they came out, within the past year and said, we want you all to have a secondary appointment in another department. I said, well, my PhD's in Africana. Well, don't you want a secondary appointment in English? No, my degree's in Africana. My master's in Africana. My BA would have been in Africana if they had it at the time. And so let's talk about that. So in literary Africology, that's just basically approaching the analysis of Africana literature with disciplinary competency. And again, this question comes up, what do we do after we read? And so the next several slides, briefly, I'm just going to introduce you to these concepts of what we do differently in the Africana Studies classroom, because people don't know it, they don't understand it, and it works for us in the community, in the classroom, and even in our individual reading. So pairing is basically, in Africana Studies, we'll take a text, and my best example of this is Elizabeth Nunez's novel, Anna in Between. She's a Trinidadian American writer. She writes about a Trinidadian professional going home to see her parents, and her mother has breast cancer that she has just left to fester and is afraid of doctors and medicine. And so in my class, my students leave with a competency not only in understanding literary structure, but they also learn breast cancer because we have associated that with the Africana Studies category of health science and technology. And I added that category just keeping a list of now 18 subject areas in Africana Studies, and we'll see a slide on that, but it's even a category in the Stewart and Talmadge Anderson Intro to Africana Studies book, Science and Technology. And so my students get science and technology, plus literary structure and form, and the things that you need to know, as I.E. Kweyarma says, to learn how to be a writer. And so that's pairing. The next one is attention to Africana reader response. We bring our entire knowledge, history, what we've learned in Sunday school, what we've learned from our parents, what we've learned from our Rastafarian uncle, what we've learned in our education, what we've read on the side. We bring all of that to a text, and the text is often symbolic, but we have expectations about culture and expectations about what to see in these texts. And it helps us to discern what is truly an African or an African or African diaspora diasporic text, or what some of the levels and shifts are if we don't see the aspects of our worldview represented in literary text. And then you also get a condition where the students end up teaching the teacher. If you have a teacher saying, oh, I wrote my thesis on a Toni Morrison novel, and I read the anthology here, the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. Now I can come in this Africana Studies classroom. Our students, if they're a Black audience, are often teaching the teacher because there's some things that they haven't learned and studied, and sometimes they have not stepped up to address the learning curve. And so Africana reader response is another one of these. The bibliographic shift is really interesting. I think the ancestors just gave that to me. I want you to look at this text box. I couldn't get it from my phone. Just the fact that you see a text box right there, right? That's just not even half the book. I don't know. Oh, you probably can't see my screen. You can see the other one. Okay, well, what happens in literature is that when we study, say a Toni Morrison novel, and I want to write on it or have my students write on it for class, they can go to the annals and they'll be 30, 40, or maybe not Toni Morrison, but a writer lesser known, 20, 30, 40 articles. And if I'm writing from an Africana perspective, looking for Africana information, I refuse to do a lit review that requires me, as I be a good researcher and I exhaust the sources in my research, I'm not telling you what all of these people did to prove to you as a reviewer or a journal that I've read everything in it, and then I'm going to waste page count. And so I've devised the way of, I take the theme of all of those articles, I put them in a text box with a listing of the themes, and I don't have to give a citation, but I have met the standard for rigorous scholarship. And so the bibliographic shift just says it corrects the condition when other disciplines grounding and reviews of literature are not really relevant to the Africological perspective that I may be pursuing in the text. Another one is disciplinary competency. I drive this home that in every Africana Studies course, beyond intro, we still are accountable to be teaching the discipline. So whether it's sociology or race or it's dance or other things, our students need to have disciplinary competency. And so it's aware, and it's also an awareness of the academic and practical requirements. But this happens in literature as well. And people think that literature is just kind of a buy, that we don't have to do this. I love this next one, dutiful survey. Yes, I've given it a name, but other people have been doing this all along. It's rereading the classics for contemporary enlightenment. How are you going to know the continuum of Africana thought if you don't stay fresh? And I've read things when I was 15, I've read them later when I'm 25, and I read them when I was 26, 27. I can start telling my age, but I've reread text, and I've reread Du Bois and Fanon and Shirley Ann Williams and essays by Toni Morrison and Richard Wright. And with every rereading, now that we're smarter, we get a greater reinforcement and enlightenment. And we see how the elders, how those, the ancestors and those who've written essays, and they don't have to be all deceased, we see how rereading that was some genius that they granted and imparted to us. And so we have to be mindful of our tradition, because that's how we come up with these ideas that sustain Africana studies. And we remain familiar with intellectual tradition. And so we're aware of when and how we are creating something new. The next is Canon Summary. I just flashed this, 2,500, 3,000 page anthology of Black literature. We only, in Africana Studies, we only get students maybe one time, maybe twice. And if they're majors or minors, we get, 30, 20, 30, 40 of those more, but we cannot reteach the full chronology and in English disciplines, timelines, and periodizations in Africana Studies. We do a type of sampling, but it still doesn't limit the responsibility of Africana instructors of literature to know the canon so that we can quickly summarize it, we can identify the literary traditions, or we can show documentaries. And so Canon Summary is us giving a quick background of what English may walk through during the whole semester, but we cover it as well, just in our own way. The next one is idea formation modeling. Sometimes we look at scholars, and as Dr. Santi presented this at the beginning of the lecture. He said, when you take an Afrocentric perspective, you come up with all new ways of approaching knowledge and original ideas. And we watch all the pundits on TV, and you're like, I should be there. I could have said something more enlightened than that coming from an Afrocentric perspective. And so idea formation modeling, it shows how it shows how our Africana logic and our worldview and how we are trained to think. And so even new literature people coming to Africana Studies, we still have to continue to train them how to think in Africana structures. And I apologize for talking so fast. I'm going to slow down. The next, in the literature classroom, we concentrate on applied functionality. And so this is allowing, literature is classified as the humanities. Most Africana studies are classified in the social sciences because we do engage in problem solving, and literature is no different. I remember a good friend of mine when we were at Temple, she said, what does literature contribute to the struggle? And I was like, oh, how can you say that? But I realized that a lot of us don't know because our literature has been presented to us in a way that we can kind of read and dabble in understanding protest literature, but to get it out of the classroom and the grocery line and the schools and the program planning, it is routine for me in my literature classrooms to have my students do a major assignment where they apply it. They have to tell me what they're going to teach and what part of what we've covered and to what audience and what age group and what location in the community and things like that. And so applied functionality is part of this. Another part is Afrikaner Phenomenology. We see that through literature. And it's using this culturally specific lens, this Afrocentric culturally specific lens, almost like an antenna to identify when and where and how an acute phenomena is worthy of study. And so it's how we come to our research questions, but we understand what exists and what some of the gaps are. This also relates to acknowledging what exactly is a text, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. Multi-dimensionality deals with the layering Africana subject areas. I teach my classes that there are 18 subject areas of Africana studies, and there can be more. It just depends on how you interpret this, but we keep going around saying that we're multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, but we're the discipline of Africana studies. And so this is a part of the Afrocentric lexical refinement that when we say Africana studies is a discipline, we don't want to say it's then interdisciplinary. We can say it's multidimensional, and that accounts for the subject areas. And so I can take any novel, any poem, any play, and have my students subject that to the 18 subject areas. And they're going to tell you what its historical or economic or Black political or Black creative production or Black philosophy implications are. The next is isolation. This is tricky. I once met a scholar who we were interviewing for a job, and she kept saying, I don't do literature. I'm like, the job is literature. I don't do literature. I don't do literature. And then so she was shifting her identity in Africana studies to be someone who uses literature to teach culture. And it's like, that's good, but we have, that's okay, but it's incomplete. And so when, as Aikwe Arma again said, we have to, if you're teaching literature, you have to make sure you're teaching it so that the future writers coming from this classroom, from this pool, will know how to write. They'll know about character and point of view and conflict and narrative and all these other things that our experts, our artists, our writers are putting in these texts. But there's also this other thing that in terms of isolation, I can pick up a text that everybody critiques for gender, for Black feminism, for womanism, and say, no, I want to locate the Africanity in this text. I want to follow that, and that is legitimate, even though people will look at it and be like, it's legitimate. And we don't have to fight for legitimacy in these spaces, but isolation, we have a name for it, and it's worldview isolation or isolation of ideas in texts that are important and primary to Africana studies. We may cover everything else, but we want our students to also be able to read Ann Petrie, The Street, and find the Africanity in it, because this Africana studies training, they now know what to look for. Okay, and so that's, now we're going to get to the part, what should we read? And that's a challenging question to ask a literature professor, but we have lots of answers for you, and we're going to walk through this. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the topics of what I've been reading, what I've been studying over the years that appear in my book, Transcendence in the Africana Literary Enterprise. Luckily, it finally went to paperback, which makes it affordable, but many libraries, it's free at Pitt in my library in digital copy. So we're going to walk through 12 chapter examples that show us how we pair, what pairing is, how we approach Afrikaner phenomenology, how we approach Afrikaner reader response and isolation, and some other things are going to creep in here. I can't talk about these without talking about location theory, without talking about the continuum, without talking about classical African reference points in the Afrocentric enterprise, including literature. And so the first is, we're all familiar with the souls of Black folk. You should read The Souls of Black Folk, but you can read the whole thing. You could read a chapter, you can read a page, you can read a quotation, just read. But we've done so much with the souls of Black folk that in this sense, I'm pairing, I'm isolating the essay of The Passing of the Firstborn, and then pairing that with a study of Black Lives Matter. Du Bois lost his firstborn, his son. They couldn't get a doctor. They couldn't get a doctor to tend to him. And even at the funeral, they're standing graveside and whites are walking by saying racist things and not valuing Black life. And in this case, not valuing Black male life. And so we can read or reread in dutiful survey The Souls of Black Folk and be able to apply that to Black Lives Matter and be able to apply that to the contemporary wealth of discussions on Black masculinity. And even in the introduction on that chapter, I talk about, I remember mentioning Tommy Curry, his book, The Man Knot, had just come out, where he really goes deep about Black masculinity and Black male studies. And so again, after reading this, we can leave the room and say, yes, we understand the essay form. We understand as Du Bois's structural writing, because an essay is nonfiction literature, but we also understand how we can apply that to today. In this approach too, I also compared paired Du Bois's of The Passing of the Firstborn with Dorothy West's 1948 novel, The Living is Easy. If you ever want to read a fun novel, a shocking novel about an African-American female villain, this is the novel for you. There's a fascinating wife, mother, sister-in-law, female villain manipulator, and she does much of this through letter writing. And when you look at how it's been managed in the bibliography in terms of criticism, everybody talks about women. There's so many husbands and sons and brother-in-laws and brothers in this text that if you have a balanced Afrikaner womanist reading, you're going to look at gender complementarity and say, Dorothy West is really making a statement about men. You see men who are providers, who are willing to give, get blood out of a turnip, give their last drop to provide for their families in spite of oppression through law, economic oppression, and other things. And that conversation is just missed because this novel is classified as kind of Black feminist literature. And so that is the pairing. We pair that again with Black masculinity and get a rich reading from that. We could also look at some psychological dimensions of narcissistic personality disorder, because the way this woman manipulates seems to be a medical condition as well. And so again, students leave the classroom knowing more than just about a literary text. Another one is Claude Mckay's Banjo from 1929. I wrote about this in terms of the title was, Can't the Race Stand a Joke? And the question was, humor and Pan-African folk negotiation in Banjo. This is really it's veterans from the United States, Africa, countries in Africa like Senegal, Europe, Canada. They all encounter each other in the Caribbean in post-World War I Marseille, France. And it almost reads like this set of all of these men playing the dozens, and then they're hungry and they share. So they share, they fight, they share, they fight, they share, they fight. But it's a really interesting a study on the sociology of Pan-Africanism, what that looks like on the ground. And so again, you leave an Afrikaner classroom understanding Pan-Africanism even more. You understand humor. You understand why people use the N-word and some sociological aspects of that. You understand how Mckay has them deconstruct that in the text. And we also end up learning more about colonialism. But these are not just snippets that we're presenting in a quick lecture. Our students are being immersed in this in the 2 weeks or the 4 to 6 sessions that it takes for us to study this. And the same thing for laypersons. And so we understand how pairing works here. You might be familiar with Iola Leroy. It's considered a sentimental novel by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. This is a fascinating novel in terms of what to read because the main character, the protagonist, Iola Leroy, at the beginning of the novel, she's white. And she doesn't learn that she's Black until a little later. And she has to make a choice about whether she's going to live Black or pass as white. And so a lot of questions about loyalty to the Black race, cultural memory of enslavement and what the white enslavers did to you, and how people, how African people have dedicated their lives to progress, to liberation, remembering that, not dedicating their lives to remember trauma, but in turn to not be a victim and move on beyond that. And so again, Iola Leroy, coming from an Afrikaner trained, all the things we study in Afrikaner studies, all the socio-political thought and all the history and all the gender from an Afrikaner studies lens, like at Temple, I read Iola Leroy and again, go to the criticism and find that they're only talking about gender, and they're talking about passing and some other things. And I said, I found some of the most impressive morsels of African philosophy planted by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in 1893 that need to be illuminated. And the English department is not paying attention to those. We're not expecting them to do, because God bless the child has got his own. We have our own in Afrikaner, and those are the things that we are emphasizing. And so again, the bibliographic shift I introduced before, but the same thing happens from Ann Petrie's novel, 1946, The Street. And you're saying, we really need to take a look at the biography of these writers to learn who they are, where they came from, how their grandparents and great-grandparents affected them. And we can see the legacy, again, of a novel that people emphasize only for its gender constructs, a single Black mother trying to raise her son in an urban environment, and she has to deal with work and singing jazz and being domestic and trying to find a suitor or a husband and childcare. All of these things, they are important, but there's also significant philosophies about Africanity, about African existence, about understanding our legacy and our continuum and from whence we've come. And that's unusual to be, it's not approached like that in English department classrooms and in the criticism. So here's a different approach. This is, here I was able to conceptualize Black cultural mythology. That's paying attention to the balance of hero dynamics in terms of myth and mythology and storytelling about our heroes and how we maintain the mythological structure. But here, the suggestion is that if we're going to read, we would read the autobiography or the memoir, Here I Stand, and while the St. Clair, I forgot his last name. While the documentary is available, we should not overlook that as well. Documentary is classified as literature. And so to pair these together, the autobiography you read with the documentary that you then have, video footage of Robeson, of his family, you have first-person eyewitness testimony from people who knew him. That pairing makes for a richer experience. And in terms of Afrikaner reader response, or what is a readable text, a film then becomes a readable text. And our Afrikaner reader response says, wow, I just read this it functions as an autobiography, even though he calls it a memoir. It's so rich about his life. We're yearning to have more. And in this digital age, we can pull up just on YouTube or something, excerpts, or on Canopy through our university policies or order it through Amazon, we can get the documentary too. And that becomes rich family experience where we can collectively engage a documentary, a film source as a readable text and get more reinforcement than just the written word. And that is the process of how we shift from the written word. We're an oral culture, and we had our ancestors had the jelly or the griot had genius brains where they could remember all these factors, all these facts about our culture. Now we shift to writing, but media is also a way of shifting back to storytelling, including the audiobook. And so I want us to be mindful of the shift in the genres. We've never abandoned storytelling and then the oral tradition, but this is another aspect of it in terms of taking in documentaries. And so you're like, what we should read? We've all read Raisin in the Sun, but did you read it in an Africological way? And so Raisin in the Sun, we should go back and read and reread A Raisin in the Sun. And you're familiar with the African-American family anticipating a life insurance check from the deceased patriarch, and they want to buy a house. In college, and I did an independent study with the white theater professor, and I was studying Black arts theater while I was also being trained by just a master of Black theater, a director who came from New York to Richmond, Virginia. And I turned in my final paper, and he would not grade it unless I changed my interpretation of Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun to say that she was integrationist. And I mean, when you read Hansberry's life writings, her work on her ideas, her philosophy, her rubbing elbows with James Baldwin and Richard Wright and others, and having her own ideas on her own merit, coming out of Chicago, observing her family, suing local districts. She's rich and she's international and she's aware. And so we read A Raisin in the Sun so much, but we overlook the character of Joseph Assegai. And so that is the most obvious example of Pan-Africanism, if you will, in the text, but there are more. So if you're trained in Africana studies, you're going to pick up on the cues of what she said. And so there's one part where Walter Lee Younger introduces his son, forgot his name, introduced his little boy to the white man who's trying to pay them not to move into the affordable housing that just happens to be in a white neighborhood. And he says, "This is my son, Travis. My son, I want you to meet him. He represents the 6th generation of our family in this country." That's not an assimilationist and integrationist comment that my son is the 6th generation of our people. Who are our people? Our people are African. And there are also some really important conversations that the Nigerian student Joseph Assegai has with the young college student Benitha. But here, in the sense of pairing, we can pair this with the Obasi Flores Myers, Linda Jane Myers, as a 3-person authored Black psychology essay on the Black psychology worldview analysis scale. In this, I recommend that scale you can give the test. It has a high reliability. You can give it to a room full of mixed people, Black and white Americans, and from their answers about worldview and culture and cosmology and values, you can pretty acutely determine who's a Black respondent and who's a white respondent. And so I recommend subjecting the characters in the text based on what we learn about them to the worldview analysis scale. And it gives us a whole new opening of how to merge Black psychology, in this case with drama, in this case with the topic of literature and Pan-Africanism in literature, or even exploring African-American identity for Africanism. And of course, we know it exists, but we have examples in the literary text that come out automatically from a Black writer, in this case, Lorraine Hansberry. We're doing good? You all with me? I want some thumbs up. Okay, all right. So the next one, and I just have a few more slides. The next one is, let's read August Wilson's, the 3rd play in his Century Cycle installment called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. And so Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, I think you might have seen it on TV. Some people don't even know it's a play. They're just watching it. They're just watching it on TV, but it's a view of the 1920s blues scene. But one member in Ma Rainey's band, his name is Toledo. And Toledo is the one character in the play who is constantly talking about African civilization and the Egyptians and Ethiopians and Booker T. Washington, and he's the conscious brother in the set. And so when you read this play in Africana studies, your antenna are up in the terms of Africana Phenomenology, and you're like, whoa, who is this brother? How did we learn that? He's the only one who knows it. How did he learn it? And that's a pursuit that then sends us back to the annals of history to learn that, wow, the Negro Studies movement, the early Black history movement, Black Studies movement was in full effect in the 1920s, 1930s. That's where he derived his information. So it sends us back to a bibliography about Blackness and Black-centeredness and the Black tradition, intellectual tradition, and it's stimulated by a literary text, in this case by a play. So again, our students leave and we understand the bibliography that Toledo knew, because as Africana thinkers, Africana professors, we understand that there's more to it than just Toledo's the one that they keep teasing because he knows so much about African history and African civilization. You're not going to get that in those other classrooms. And that's the specificity and the exceptionalism of doing this in Africana studies. One of my favorite examples of this is, go ahead and read Octavia Butler's novel, Parable of the Sower. It's set about 50 years, maybe like 2050, I think. It's set in the future, but it follows the survival choices of a young African-American teenager in an apocalyptic dystopian US setting. People were really talking about this novel while Trump was president, but when society gets so bad that she has to kind of make choices about survival. She's almost set up some people call it a neo-enslavement narrative, but she's almost like a 17-year-old Harriet Tubman. But what she does to survive and get her mind right is, she's a preacher's daughter, a Black Christian preacher's daughter. She starts thinking about her own relationship with God. And she starts writing her verses, and it emerges as a belief system called Earthseed. And so my approach to this, the question is Earthseed Black liberation theology? Well, I've taken Africana studies. I've studied the subject area of religion. I'm aware of Black liberation theology. And so we're talking about Katie Cannon and James Cone in my class. You're not talking about that in English. And so our students are shortchanged if we teach literature and don't explore it for all of this pairing with some of the key subject areas of Africana studies. That is when we have holistic learning in Africana studies literature classroom. This next one is interesting too, because I want to focus on what is a readable text. So here's what happened. And I think it was 1998. I was living in Albany, New York. I was writing my dissertation and teaching at a small college in Albany. Dr. Clark passed, and I said, I've got to be at that funeral. It was at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. I got in a car accident 5 blocks away. Someone just merged around me, knocked my car. I said, I've got to be at that funeral. I told the police, tow my car, and I went walking, limping with one shoulder higher than the other, just from the shock of someone sideswiping me to get to that funeral. They gave out an 8x10 funeral program. And in this program, Dr. Clark had written out his own self-eulogy. It was beautiful. He talked about his wife, his children, his life's work. And then the end, he said, I'm approaching heaven. I see Jesus. Du Bois is on the right and Nkrumah is on the left. They're beckoning to me. By the way, Jesus is Black. And it was beautiful, but he said a lot here in giving, his life story. And to me, that is a text. And so when you talk about what do we read, how about, I know a bunch of us have stacks of funeral programs from our family and friends and important people in our life and our community and even the field of Africana studies. You can sit there with that stack, and it doesn't have to be during Black History Month, and share their legacies with your friends, with your children, with your cousins, with your neighbors, or even a type of reflection yourself. And that, in an Africana view of literature, is also a text. I was able to find too literary criticism on self-eulogy in terms of literary structure, but it's Africana studies that's trained me to view this as a possible phenomena. And so I approached it in terms of self-eulogy as prophetic Afrofuturism. And so I was looking at Black leaders and Black heroes who anticipated their death while they're actively planning and participating in the struggle. Malcolm X does that. Dr. King does that. I just chose Malcolm X because I just needed two. And I like the fact that he gave the Islamic example and Dr. Clark gave the Christian example. And so they were ripe for comparison. And so again, what do we read? Read a piece of the book, go to the pages where Malcolm X is talking about his life and his own mortality and his willingness to give his life for his people, knowing this might take him out. He says that in many of his speeches, but read something and reflect on it. And Africology gives us this wide open view based on our own frameworks and epistemologies and Afrocentric paradigm of how we make sense of African people from an Afrikaner reader response, how we make sense of the meaning and the application and the function of these as text as African people. This is another intriguing what to read. This is a fascinating novel by Daniel Black, who has a degree from Temple's Department of Africology. Excuse me. In this story, this narrative, a mother of 6 sons goes to great lengths to ensure that her 7th child is a girl. And you got to read it to find out, unless you just want me to tell you. So what happens in this novel is there are no police, there are no white people standing around with guns. It's set in the mid-20th century. The Black community kind of polices itself. The Black community polices itself. And, but they have each community, each family, they have members of the community, they have their own sense of individual justice. It's crazy, it's dysfunctional. You can understand how they assess or interpret their own morality, but they're serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Also, what happens too, this woman ends up with 7 children. It's on the child's 7th birthday that something major happened. So this number 7's popping up. I know Dr. Karinga, and his 7s too, but you know, I'm like, justice? Look at these people taking justice and setting fire and trying to kill people and judging. I'm like, wait, where's the mayat? Where is the truth, the justice, the balance, the order, the harmony, the reciprocity, the righteousness? Where are they? They're in here. And the dysfunction of the novel is telling us that we need to run to mayat. The English department, I guarantee you, bet my paycheck is not bringing mayat into the literary classroom. And it makes so much sense when we start to study social justice and people's ideas of morality and their principles and where they've treated this. It makes so much sense to have my students leave the classroom discussing perfect peace and then coming out of that classroom understanding mayat. And that is just a beautiful example of what we do in Africana studies. I'm almost finished. So the next one is the book on the left, Maria Stewart. Maria Stewart was an abolitionist. She was a widow, and widowhood allowed her to be an abolitionist speaker in the early 1930s. So she was in the community of Boston. She was a friend of David Walker, you know, with his appeal. She was giving these fiery speeches from a platform, you know, in churches and community centers. She became the first Black woman to speak to mixed audiences of men and women. They basically ran her out of town. She moved to DC. She was destitute. She was, leaned on the alms of the church. And then eventually she finally got her pension from her husband who had fought, I mean, like 40 years later, her pension from her husband who'd fought in the War of 1812. She used that money and said, look, they don't know who I was back in my Boston days. I was a whippersnapper. I was friends with David Walker. I wrote some good stuff, and I'm going to use that pension to gather my papers to kind of mythologize my writings, because she knew she had something. She knew she was anointed. In her writing, she said, Black women, what are you going to do to immortalize yourselves and your children? And she created this Ebonic use of heroes. The speech tradition is literature. The essay is literature. And she wrote, this is stylized writing that relies on rhetorical skills and persuasion and fiery passion in your delivery. And so she had all of that. And so Marilyn Richardson gathered those. I taught it in a Black woman's class, and they exist in general, whether you read about Maria Stewart in her biography as a biographical exercise, or whether you read her actual literature, her speeches. That is part of literature, but that's also part of our commitment to dutiful survey, to be mindful of what our forebears offered us in terms of provocative philosophical ideas of their times. We find that they're relevant for us, and they're part of our history and our continuum. And so then Beyonce appears on the scene on the far right, and all of a sudden the field, cultural studies, and people in English and sociology and all these areas are like, Beyonce feminism, yeah. And it's like, you don't know, or you have to be attentive to the continuum. You can't talk about Beyonce without then talking about Lauryn Hill first. And so Lauryn Hill was a major factor in the early 2000s before that actually, but in the 2000s, she came out with her MTV Music Television Unplugged series. And so her songs were not that great, but what she did, she had interludes, as she called them, between each song. And there were these long speeches about the predicaments of being a Black woman in America. And so when I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, she's talking about the same thing that Maria Stewart was talking about in the 1830s. And if we're going to talk about contemporary Black womanists, Black feminists, and others, Black women talking about their position as a woman, their position in terms of heritage and Black worldview and Africanity, and what the mothers they need to be for their children and wives and spouses, and all these things, it exists in a continuum. And we would be remiss to not link that continuum that takes us all the way back to Maria Stewart, or as far back as we can to our classical African reference point. But you're not going to know to do that if we've just hired you to work in English and popular, Afrikaner popular culture, and you're not reading the tradition and dutiful survey. And so there's some grounding that benefits us that we teach. And so you can, again, what is a readable text? Beyonce's performances are a type of readable text in terms of media and film. Lauryn Hill's music is a readable text. So when we say, what do you read? You have a lot of options here that it doesn't necessarily have to be something written. It can be oral. And so I have two more of these examples. So some of you may remember from the DIOP conference I presented on AIDA. Broadway is text. You can go to Broadway and what you see, start it with the script. It's literary, it's stylized, it's performance too, but it is a text. And so this relates to Afrikaner reader response. So if you've ever heard me present on this, I was so delighted to see AIDA. I had the Black Storybook from Leontine Price, where AIDA was Black. It's a Nubian, it's a folktale, a Nubian folktale that talks about star-crossed lovers in Nubia and Egypt, of course, which are both African people, brown-skinned African people. Let's go to AIDA, buy those expensive tickets for my mother and my dad, and we go see it, and all the Egyptians are white, and all of the Nubians are Black. The Egyptians are white rock and roll singers dressed to the nines, and the Egyptians are Black performers dressed in potato bags and sackcloth, singing songs, singing Negro spirituals. And I was like, this is crazy. And all my friends, all these people had seen it, and no one had an Africological point of view to say, something's wrong here. We've got to talk about it. Something's wrong here. They're like, oh, a multicultural production. Something's wrong here. And so Africological training says, go back to the source, go back to the earliest reference point you can find, go dig up in those opera books to see what was happening in colonized Egypt with Giuseppe Verdi and those Italians and the British and the French trying to create an opera and manipulating this kind of indigenous folk narrative to putting on the screen with some nonsense and some plantation format. The same thing with Hamilton. And I certainly wonder what the ancestor August Wilson would have to say with the colorblind casting done from the perspective of a person of color in terms of Hamilton. And so these are texts that we need our Africological tools to examine these because they're visual performative texts. And finally, another text, when we say, what do we read? Or so we can have choice to read things, but there are also phenomena and symbols that come to us just casually in our day that they have to be read too, in the African American tradition of reading somebody out, reading their rights. So I was in Paris for I think the Richard Wright Centennial Conference, and my TV only got a couple of channels, but they kept playing this rap video, which was the top rap video at the time. And what year was that? 2000. Maybe 2008, but it was a Haitian French rapper named Kerry James. And he had a song called À l'ombre de show business, in the shadow of show business. And I kept seeing Malcolm X's face and an image of an Angela Davis style image flash across the screen. You know, it's like morning, noon, breakfast, wake up from my nap. I kept seeing this, like, what is this? And so I began to study how even our images are readable, that there's a diasporic performance and acknowledgement of each other's cultural heroes, whether it's Toussaint Louverture or whether it's others, whether it's Frantz Fanon, looking at our heroes, whether it's Kwame Nkrumah. But this rapper had picked up on Malcolm X and he was transmitting the image. And then when you go to the sources, you find that there are a lot of musicians and rap and hip hop artists internationally that are demonstrating the power of shared Africana cultural heroics. echoics. And so again, the rap video, the music video is a type of text. And so in closing, I'll see how I'm doing for time. Oh, okay. In closing, what is a text? What is a readable text? What should we read? How should we read? What should we do after we read? And all of this relates to isolation, location, Afrikaner reader response, dutiful survey, but we see all these options of what we can read. Is it a book? And we can read a book, or we can even listen to a book now. Is it a documentary we can view? Is it a play that you can read or view? Is it a speech that you can read or view or watch someone deliver, even from older videos? Is it music? So the Lauryn Hill and the Beyonce. Is it a Broadway performance? Is it an oral narrative or folktale? Is it a rap or hip hop video? And so for time, I'm going to end now, but I just want to show you this. This is what I teach my students. There are 18 subject areas of Afrikaner study. It's my model and it's functional and it works. So when I have people from English telling me they can teach Afrikaner studies and they want Afrikaner studies to go back to when it was Black studies, when you picked people from English and sociology and psychology who did Black stuff and you threw them in a curriculum, that's what they want. So they told me to my face they had no use for me and that they want our department to just kind of disappear, but we're not going anywhere. But I said, but this is what I teach in intro. So 7 of these are from Karinga's Introduction to Afrikaner Studies. Another handful are from Dr. Sante's. He adds aesthetics and culture and communication. And other ones are from my tradition of teaching and existing in Afrikaner studies, that when you tell students, this is what this field of study is, this is what this discipline is, these are some of the subject areas. They can figure out where to put anthropology, maybe in culture or some other areas, but at least they have a blueprint that should be imprinted like this kind of cheat sheet, this one single information page. And so the goal, as you see in the bottom, is to have our students to know this and to apply it to every course they take, including literature. And in the end, we want to develop critical intellectual dexterity. That means we know all of these competencies and almost like a brown rainbow above our head. We know all of this about Afrikaner studies. That's our broad cultural competency. So we may know history and literature and something else, but for the subject areas that we're not experts in, we know enough, we've been trained enough to know where to go to pursue the depth in those, to layer our multidimensional studies and to get the type of outcomes and answers that are going to be relevant to our community. So this last paragraph, we want to develop critical intellectual dexterity in managing knowledge related to people of African descent in order to become master communicators with a high cultural competency based on acutely understanding the agency and subject place of people of African descent. And so even in the literature classroom, we apply disciplinary competency. And another exercise in terms of what to read, and I can give this presentation to Dr. Sante, that I've taken each one of these subject areas and made a list of which literary text would fit in those subject areas. And so for all of those, I can tell you, you want to learn about education, here's a piece of literature for that. Health science technology, here's a piece of literature for that. And so in closing, thank you, Dr. Sante, for having me. Thank you all for your patience. I can't believe I was talking for an hour. I think I always tend to do that. But in terms of disciplinary competency, what we do in Afrikaner studies is exceptional. It has nothing to do with other people. It is unique, discipline specific. It's rare. It's an orientation that can also be mastered even when you come in terms of the learning curve. It's discipline stabilizing, and it demands practical and interpretive tools that go beyond standard literary analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you can give me back the screen. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see how to do that. Oh, okay, stop share. There we go.
There you go. Hey, thank you so much. I think that we all can applaud. We have this is the Malefic Asante Institute's lecture program. We have had 71 people on the program today. It's really been exciting and very great. And I just want to say to, right now to Dr. Temple that we really need your 18 subject area. You need to send those multi-dimensions to me, because we're going to have to try to enforce this at Temple. I really, really like this. We want to read your works on it and use it, because it's extremely important and very valuable. And I'm just going to see whether or not we don't have anybody in the chat, but are there any questions that anybody feel like they really would like to ask or a statement that they need to make?
Dr.
Yes.
Asante.
Okay, go ahead,
This is
unmute yourself. Who's this?
this is
How's
Farouk,
he? Cal?
Dr. Farouk Iman.
Yeah, go ahead. You unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. This is
Okay.
this is Dr. Imam.
I would
Yes.
like to ask,
Dr. Imam, Dr. Farouk,
yeah,
go right ahead.
yes, yes. I would like to ask Dr. Temple, what kind of projects do your students do when they're doing practical applications from the literature?
Yeah, it ranges. So in the example of teaching Elizabeth Nunez's Anna in Between, they did a whole, we call it mapping. And so the final project does not necessarily have to be a written paper. They know how to write. We've done that in shorter essays, but I said your final project is mapping. So they use digital technology to kind of put the text in the center with boxes, text boxes that take you to understand the players and the characters. And they look at disease, they give statistics, and then their job is to find someone to give that to make copies so it's available, whether it's in community centers or schools. We've also done a similar thing where they have to pull out the best philosophical quotes. And you buy that laminated placemat for your children with the 50 states and things on it. They make things like that have Africana studies information. So we've done it for women. We've done it from the James Baldwin class. It's things like that where you could have something in your hand to give away to someone to inform them. But also I tell them, look, you don't have to read the whole story. Talk to somebody in the grocery line, talk to someone in your dorm, talk to someone in the cafeteria line to just drop some knowledge, because you have to speak up now. So it also relates to what they call speaking in the disciplines. Thank you for your question, Dr. Imam.
Thank you very much.
You're
Thank you, Dr. Imam. Anybody else?
Yes, Dr. Asante, this is Dr. Kambui. May I ask a question?
Dr. Kimberly, yes, please. By all
Yes,
means.
sir. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Temple, I just want to echo both Dr. Asante's and Dr. Farouk's comment, because my comment leading to my question actually leads into that. Thank you again for your passion. I currently work in academia as well, and have worked with African American college students in a number of capacities. In light of your presentation, I see your work applicable in particular to African American college students as an intervention and goal to increase their college graduation retention rates. So in this way, how are you involved with the University of Pittsburgh and the requirement in which they made first-year students take that new one-credit class called, I guess what it was, anti-Black racism, from what I've read or heard. And, how could your work and the creation of your course, for example, be applicable in that situation to provide both a benefit and opportunity to you and the university in that way to work with students, being able to stay in school and also graduate, because we know a lot of students leave college early in that freshman or sophomore year.
Okay, I'm going to get to that direct answer to that in a moment. Let me just say that Dr. James Conyers has a volume coming out. Our new ancestor, Dr. James Conyers, has a volume coming out called Africana Urban Education. And I had the privilege of writing an article, a chapter in that called Value Added. Value Added is a market employment term, a value added approach to Intro to Africana Studies. And so just as I offer those 18 categories, and we talk about the credo of Africana Studies, taken from what Dr. Terry Kershaw wrote, another ancestor. He said, our job is to create knowledge and inspire behaviors that will increase the life chances and life experiences of people of African descent in particular, and of humanity in general. But in this essay, I link the value added. I tell students how to get a job in Africana Studies, that if you talk about the diaspora, the internationalism, the 18 subject areas, our credo, the practical and the academic and practical enterprise, I teach them how to frame that language in job interviews with Fortune 500 companies so that they can benefit from interpreting their learning, the paradigms we give them in Africology, to the workplace in ways that make people stop and listen. The other part is that Pitt doesn't value me or what I do. they're afraid. They did not, my new chair did not think my competency was important enough to even invite me to participate in those one credit sections. And in fact, the chair was put in front of that by the department as her reaction to what to ask for on behalf of Africana Studies during that fiery, robust moment of Black Lives Matter and celebrating, acknowledging the martyrdom of George Floyd. What our new chair chose to do, who's not in graduate Africana Studies, was to go to 8 other departments and ask them to please create a Black course and a cluster higher, which is watering down and giving away what we do. And so the university has really celebrated our new chair widely. And out of the 15 scholars, maybe 16 scholars who were asked to do one credit courses, she didn't ask me to do anything, and I'm the only full professor in the department. So in answer to your question, my students get this in their classes. I'm available, I'm robust, I talk to them, and we're in person. They follow me out of my classes like the Pied Piper, and I give as much time as I can before I have to leave to pick up my son to give them what they need. And so institutionally, I'm valued by my university for the stuff that I just presented to you today.
Well, I'll tell you, thank you very much for that answer. And let me just tell you one thing, and I always tell this story. When James Baldwin, just a few months before he died, I had dinner with James Baldwin in Philadelphia. I had written the playbill for one of his plays. I think it was Amen Corner, that was being produced at the Annenberg Center at University of Pennsylvania. And so I had dinner with him and with Rowena Stewart, who was the director of the African American Museum, as well as Houston Baker. There were about 6 or 7 of us at this dinner. And James Baldwin just went off on the United States, you know, how they didn't value anybody, particularly if you talked about white racism. You wouldn't get any awards, no prizes. And then the French had given him all these awards and all these, even the highest award, the Croix de Guerre. And he was just, so I said to him, I said, but Jimmy, and this is what I'm saying to you, you know, Christel, you live in our hearts. You don't care. You're a full professor. You don't care what Pitt says. Do I care what Temple, what the deans and all these people said? No, you do your work for the people. That work lasts for eternity. And so I just want you to remember that. And I would say that to Jimmy. And Jimmy, wait a minute. They may not value you. We value you. And our value to you is greater than anything they could give to you by giving you these awards. Say, what does that matter to you? You don't know.
Absolutely,
What
yeah.
matters is that you live in the hearts of the people. And that is the great thing.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do my work, and I teach my classes. I come home and I do selective service, and I will continue to be excellent.
And take care of talent.
In the best traditions of our people. You know, I got full. They didn't want to give it to me. I gave them books. I mean,
there you go.
They couldn't deny it. So they tried to slow walk it, and then I called them all out. So I'm celebrating over here.
There you go.
And I'm doing us. But thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. Yes. All right.
Dr. Sante,
Dr. Joyce King. Yes, Dr. King.
Yeah. Sister, what you presented is beyond brilliant. And I thank you so much for your contribution. I will be using it, and I'll be contacting you because I'm doing a project with some HBCUs, and I want to bring you in to share some of what you've been doing. And so I really appreciate you, and I want to second what Dr. Asante said. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I remember your book, just your book on education. I want to say from the early 2000s. Yes. And so when we include the categories and we have education, that's directly related to what you and Dr. Johns, Jufu and others have done, that our students have to be aware of that as an intellectual category of Africana studies beyond the School of Ed.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Okay. I think that's, I don't see any other.
I have a question.
Okay, okay. Wahida, how you doing, Wahida? Very
I'm
good.
well, Dr. Asante.
Go right ahead.
I have a quick question. Were you able to see the recent Ma Rainey's Black Bottom on Netflix? And if so, did you notice that there was that lack of context from Toledo's character? And I think that, well, first of all, I wanted to ask that question. And the reason I'm asking that question is because often I notice a lot of times when things are translated to, a movie or a film or a show, there's a lot of that teachable moment, from an Africana and Afrocentric standpoint that's lost, either lost in translation or just completely absent. And is there a market for something like that in which, people can be, kind of, we seek those individuals who can help us to make sure that we keep that context there?
Yes, I
And if
did
not,
see
maybe is there a way
that.
to create it? Sorry.
Yeah, there's definitely a way to create it. I mean, this is an August Wilson play. All the writers, including Toni Morrison, she would be number two. But August Wilson did not hesitate to call us Africans and to use the word Afrocentric in his writing. He was unflinching. And so we could teach a segment, a unit on him alone in terms of his writing. And so he knew what he was doing when he wrote that character Toledo. And it's kind of like the coded language that that your African viewers, your African American, your African viewers are going to know what exactly what he's saying we're going to know what he's saying to us. And we're going to go back and follow the breadcrumbs that he left. I mean, actually, he wrote us a map to us, hand stamped, with extra postage on it to make sure we get it and to see how unconscious the actors and the screenwriters are about our tradition, that they will take our gems, our philosophical gems in terms of writing and artistry, and throw them on the screen and make parts of them ugly and make parts of them aspiritual and cursing God in a sense that wasn't. My dad's a preacher. My mother said, I watched that and they cursed God so much I almost turned the TV off. And I said, I don't want to see it. I'll catch it later. But also the same thing happened with the Harriet movie. I sat right beside one of the actors at the Aswad conference, and they were all excited and singing the songs. And I was like, what have you all done? What have you done? We've got this category of health science and technology and Africanism and all these things. If you write about Harriet Tubman, I want you to tell me that you wish you could, see into her brain and see that photographic memory and see the horticulture and the agriculture. And she was a genius and able to be able to layer all of these naturalistic elements and to be able to look out into the skies and the trees and from a mountaintop and be able to map that and remember it and to transmit it. That's what our children need to know about these pieces. And so we look at Harriet Tubman, faces about to be on the $20 bill, and she is our hero. You all have been watering her down like some nice little grandma eating apples for the longest time. And she's so much more brilliant than that. But then again, that same brilliance, we know she's a hero. You act like the text of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is not heroic, and it is, and August Wilson wrote it for us to see it in that way. And so in terms of what we can do, we take in all this stuff that media, I mean, it's Netflix, it's Hulu, it's YouTube Homemade. We take all of this in, and there's no space for the critical analysis that's required to say this part or this actually is going to trash. Don't watch that. And then people get mad and all Twitter huffy when you have to tell them, that wasn't so great after all. And so there's so much intervention, Wahida, that's required, but we can do it one person at a time. Each one tell one and stake that claim. Like they're about to do Nella Larson's Passing. I'm like, here we go. Here we go. So long answer to a short question. I do see William Witherspoon's hand too up.
Okay,
Dr. Temple,
Kamika,
thank you.
yes.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to add that under your 18 subject matters where you have creative production, maybe there's that subcategory where we look at the political economy of arts production in countries that don't honor our liberation and our African story. And then that's where you can tease out the ways in which they can turn an August Wilson character who's so dynamic and such a Pan-Africanist into something very different. But you already have it in your 18 subject areas, so I thank you for that.
But we need to, you said political economy of art.
Yes, as a subcategory of that creative production. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for all that you do.
You're welcome, and you too, because again, these categories mean so much because I've heard so many of you speak and to offer this fire, and I'm just in the club. I'm just happy to be here. Thank you, Dr. Williams-Witherspoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank everybody. You guys are really wonderful. And on the 28th of February, our next speaker is going to be Dr. Raylan Rabaka. He's going to be talking about Pan-Africanism, decolonization, unification, liberation. Dr. Raylan Rabaka is one of our key philosophers of political thought and culture. And he's going to be here, and we're going to look forward to him. He's going to have to really go full steam ahead because the people who have come before him have really just set the high mark. The ID number, for those of you who want to take it down now, is going to be 829 1399 8476. That's 829 1399 8476. February the 28th at 4 o'clock, Dr. Raylan Rabaka. And I want to once again just give praise to Dr. Christel Temple for your incredible work. And I do need to, I'll give you a call, Dr. Temple, because regarding the department at Pitt, because I did get a letter that I should share with you.
Okay.
Anyway, I just want to alert you to that. But okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today. And
Thank you all.
you guys, thanks. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Oh,
Awesome.
bravo, bravo, bravo.
Awesome. Awesome.
Oh, my Lord.